Hey everyone, what's going on? Thanks for tuning into part 4 of our discussion of Chapter 18. We're going to be finishing up by talking about the Gadsden Purchase and also talking about the Kansas and Nebraska Act. So let's get into it. When we left off, the United States was out in Asia attempting to make new trade partners, and in Latin America attempting to build a canal and take new territory, potentially even to spread slavery. The country was also in an uproar over California. Now, at this time, traveling west was, as we know, tough. You could either take a 6-month route around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, or you could risk yellow fever and other diseases by crossing Panama and traveling via ship to San Francisco, or you could even go via wagon. But either way you did it, it was going to be dangerous. Now, in 1856, Jefferson Davis, who was the Secretary of War for Pierce, and also the future president of the Confederate States of America, actually created a Camel Corps of the U.S. Army. Yeah, I'm not kidding when I say this. You can actually see the cover of his proposal to Congress on the screen. And he did this because many people thought that maybe they could use camels to travel out west. Well, thankfully they realized that the Transcontinental Railroad would probably be a better route. Now, to do this, they needed a route that avoided Nebraska, which was basically this huge unorganized territory that was controlled largely by Buffalo and Native Americans, and instead they wanted a territory that lay below the mountain ranges and away from potential Native American attacks. So, Jefferson Davis is going to appoint this guy named James Gadsden to be the minister to Mexico. Gadsden was a railroad man and had a special interest in building the railroad. Now, the result of Gadsden going down to Mexico was that in 1853, he is going to purchase a stretch of land from Mexico that would later become a part of Arizona and New Mexico. Now, Gadsden's purchase for $10 million provided the land that was necessary for a southern transcontinental railroad that would go through Texas and would end in Los Angeles. Now, the first continental railroad, the first true continental railroad, would eventually be finished in 1869, well after the Civil War. And when it is finished, it will cut the travel time for the 3,000-mile journey across the United States to under a week. This was a massive, massive improvement. With talk of a railroad in the South and Nebraska being unsettled, Northerners felt that they should settle Nebraska and have their own railroad. And there were tons of citizens waiting to settle in Nebraska. They just needed a reason to go. Enter Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, aka the Little Giant. Douglas wanted to continue westward expansion and felt that a railroad was the best option. Not to mention, Douglas had invested heavily in Chicago real estate and railroads, and felt that if he pushed enough, he could get Chicago to be the railroad hub, connecting the east to the west. So, in 1854, he is going to propose a scheme where the United States would split the territory of Nebraska into 2 different parts, and it would become Kansas and Nebraska. The issue of slavery, Douglas said, would be solved by popular sovereignty, which, as I'm sure you guys remember, is the idea that those in each territory would decide whether to be slave or free. Douglas assumed that Kansas would likely become a slave state because it lay next to Missouri, which was a slave state, and Nebraska would be a free state because it lay next to Iowa, which was a free state. Now, it's important to note that the scheme completely contradicted the Missouri Compromise, which said that no slavery would go above the 3630 line. Now, Southerners were pumped by the idea that they could make Kansas into another slave state, and Northerners were highly offended because the Missouri Compromise to them was a very serious deal. But we have a president in President Pierce who essentially did whatever people told him to do, and he is going to back Douglas's scheme. And despite attacks from abolitionists, Douglas was truly a powerful debater, and he was able to twist enough facts to get his way, thus passing the Kansas and Nebraska Act in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, as we will come to find out in the next chapter, set the country up for a civil war and really pitted the country more than any other thing against one another. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we know as no friend to the Fugitive Slave Act, stated, "The fugitive slave law did much to unglue the eyes of men, and now the Nebraska bill leaves us staring." And it is on that shaky ground that we are going to conclude chapter 18, and we are going to pick back up and find out what happens to the country in the next era. Thanks for watching, everyone.